Imagine being a parent and hearing that your daughter went to a shopping mall with a friend and never came home. You call her phone. Nothing. You call her friends. Nobody knows where she is. Then the police arrive at your door, and before they can even finish speaking, you realize something has happened that you may never be able to undo. But in Northern California in 1978, two families were about to receive almost the same nightmare. Two teenage girls had disappeared, and somewhere in the darkness, a man and a woman were driving away in a van. The woman could smile. She could talk to the victims. She could make them feel safe. And that was exactly what made the couple so dangerous. Their names were Gerald and Charlene Gallego. For nearly 2 years, the couple would move across parts of California, Nevada, and Oregon, leaving behind terrified families, abandoned vehicles, missing person reports, and eventually graves. At least 10 people would be murdered. But the most disturbing part of the story was not simply that Gerald was a killer. It was that he did not always work alone. Charlene was there. Sometimes she drove. Sometimes she helped lure victims. And sometimes, according to her later testimony, she watched while the man she lived with carried out his horrifying fantasies. The story began long before police understood what they were dealing with. Gerald Gallego had a criminal history and a violent personality. Charlene Williams was much younger when the two became involved. Their relationship became increasingly unstable and dangerous. According to accounts presented during the later trials, Gerald developed an obsession with finding women and girls he could control. He referred to them as sex slaves. It was not simply a fantasy he kept inside his head. It became a plan. And in September 1978, that plan became murder. On September 11, 1978, 16-year-old Kippy Vaught and 17-year-old Rhonda Scheffler were at a shopping mall in the Sacramento area. They were teenagers. They had families. They had ordinary lives. There was no reason for anyone to believe that night would be their last. But the Gallegos approached them. The girls disappeared. For their families, the hours that followed must have felt endless. At first there was hope. Maybe the girls were somewhere together. Maybe they had gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe they would walk through the door. But the hope collapsed the next day. The bodies of Kippy and Rhonda were discovered in a field east of Sacramento. The girls had been abducted, sexually assaulted, beaten, and shot. Suddenly, this was no longer a missing person investigation. It was murder. Yet investigators did not immediately know who had done it. There was no obvious killer standing in front of them. No confession. No dramatic arrest. Just two dead teenagers and families demanding answers. And somewhere nearby, Gerald and Charlene Gallego were still free. They did not disappear after the first murders. Instead, they continued living their lives. For months, nothing connected them publicly to the killings. Then, in June 1979, two more young girls disappeared in Nevada. Brenda Judd was 14. Sandra Colley was 13. They had been taken from Reno. Again, the nightmare began with disappearance. Again, families waited. Again, investigators searched. And again, the victims did not come home. The evidence eventually connected the girls to the Gallegos, but their bodies were never recovered. For young victims had now vanished into a case that investigators were struggling to understand, and the killers were becoming bolder. The couple's pattern was beginning to emerge. They traveled. They searched for vulnerable victims. They used deception, and they relied on the appearance of normality. That was one of the most terrifying elements of the case. Gerald and Charlene did not look like the kind of couple people expected to fear. They could drive into a town, park somewhere, talk to people, and leave without immediately attracting attention. But behind that ordinary appearance was a partnership built around violence. Then came 1980, and the killings accelerated. In April, two 17-year-old girls, Stacy Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs, disappeared after being picked up near a shopping mall in the Sacramento area. This time, the victims would be taken across state lines. Their bodies were eventually discovered in rural Nevada. The girls had been beaten to death with a hammer. Investigators now had another double murder, but they still had no idea how close they were to identifying the people responsible. Then came another victim. Her name was Linda Aguilar. She was 21. In June 1980, She encountered the Gallegos while traveling in Oregon. What happened next was horrifying. She was assaulted and killed, and her body was left near Gold Beach. Investigators later learned that the Gallegos had been responsible. The killings were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming a pattern. A couple was traveling through different states, taking people, killing them, and disappearing. And each time they moved, they left behind another grieving family. Then, in July 1980, another woman disappeared. Virginia Macho was 34 and worked at a bar in West Sacramento. She was kidnapped from a parking lot. Her body was later found in Clarksburg. At this point, investigators were dealing with a string of murders spread across multiple jurisdictions. California, Nevada, Oregon, different police departments, different investigators, different crime scenes. But the same killers were moving through them, and they still had not been caught. The Gallegos eventually separated for a period of time, but the violence did not end. By late 1980, Gerald was still looking for victims, and then he made a mistake, one that would finally begin closing the net around him. It happened after a fraternity-related gathering in the Sacramento area. Craig Miller was 22. Mary Beth Sowers was 21. They were together when Gerald targeted them. A witness saw something. That witness noticed a kidnapping. And unlike some of the earlier cases, someone was able to provide investigators with important information about the vehicle and its license plate. Suddenly, police had something they could work with: a description, a vehicle, a possible suspect. The investigation began moving faster. But Gerald and Charlene were already gone. They left California and headed east. For the first time, the couple that had spent nearly 2 years moving to the shadows was running from the police. But they did not yet know that investigators were closing in. They had survived multiple crimes. They had crossed state lines. They had left victims behind. And somehow, they had avoided arrest. Now they were traveling toward Nebraska. They believed they could disappear again. They were wrong, because this time the police had a trail. And waiting at the end of that trail was an arrest that would expose one of the most disturbing murder partnerships America had seen. On November 17, 1980, Gerald and Charlene Gallego were finally captured in Omaha. The nightmare was over, but the questions were only beginning. How many people had they really killed? How much had Charlene known? Was she a terrified accomplice who feared Gerald? Or was she an active participant who had willingly helped him find victims? And most importantly, why had nobody been able to stop them sooner? The answers would emerge slowly. And when Charlene finally began talking, investigators learned that the story was even darker than they had imagined, because the woman who had traveled beside Gerald was about to become the prosecution's most important witness. And she was about to tell the world what happened inside that van. When Charlene Gallego was arrested, she knew that her life had changed forever, but she also knew something else. Gerald was facing the possibility of execution, and she was facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The couple had spent years presenting themselves as partners. Now, they were turning against each other. Charlene eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Her testimony would become one of the most important pieces of evidence against Gerald. She described a relationship in which Gerald's violent fantasies had become reality. According to her testimony, he wanted victims he could control, and Charlene sometimes helped him find them. That meant the investigation could finally begin connecting the dots between the murders. The first victims were Kippy Vaught and Rhonda Scheffler, then Brenda Judd and Sandra Colley, then Stacy Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs, then Linda Aguilar, then Virginia Macho, and finally Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers. 10 confirmed victims, 10 lives destroyed, 10 families left with memories that could never be repaired. But even after the arrests, the case was far from finished. The prosecution had to prove Gerald's responsibility in court, and Gerald was not going to make that easy. In California, he was charged in connection with the murders of Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers. The evidence against him was devastating. A witness had seen the abduction. The victims had been taken in his vehicle. Charlene could testify, and investigators had gathered physical evidence connecting him to the crimes. But Gerald chose an extraordinary strategy. He decided to represent himself during the guilt phase of his California trial. He stood in court and attempted to defend himself. He denied the prosecution's version of events. He argued that the killings had not happened in the way prosecutors claimed. But the jury was not persuaded. After deliberations, Gerald Gallego was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of kidnapping. The jury also found special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. He was sentenced to death. But that was not the end. Nevada also wanted justice for 2 teenage girls whose bodies had been found there. Stacy Redican, Karen Chipman Twiggs, 2 17-year-olds whose lives had ended violently. The Nevada case would expose even more of the couple's horrifying pattern. During the trial, Charlene testified about the abduction. The evidence showed that Gerald had taken the girls, transported them to Nevada, and murdered them. A Nevada jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Again, the sentence was death. Gerald had now been condemned to die in 2 states. Charlene's fate was dramatically different. Because she had agreed to testify against Gerald, prosecutors offered her a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to murder charges and received a sentence of 16 years and 8 months. Her testimony had helped prosecutors secure Gerald convictions, but her cooperation created a question that has never completely disappeared from the case. How much responsibility did Charlene herself bear? She later claimed that she had participated because she feared Gerald. She maintained that he controlled her, but prosecutors argued that she had played a role in helping him find victims. The court heard evidence that she had helped lure victims into the couple's vehicle. In a Nevada case involving Stacy and Karen, the state's highest court later upheld Gerald's conviction and death sentence. The court concluded that the trial had been fair and that there was sufficient evidence supporting the conviction. The couple who had once moved together from place to place were now permanently separated. Gerald was sent to death row. Charlene went to prison. For the families, however, no verdict could bring their loved ones back. And there was another painful reality. Several of the victims had disappeared without their bodies ever being recovered. For some families, there was never a final moment of seeing their daughter or sister laid to rest. Only questions, only memories, only the knowledge that someone they loved had been taken from them. Years passed. Gerald continued fighting his death sentences through appeals. His execution was delayed repeatedly. In 1997, one of his Nevada death sentences was overturned for a new penalty hearing, but the possibility of freedom never came. At the new penalty hearing in 1999, Gerald admitted his guilt and apologized to the victims' families. The jury once again recommended death. The sentence was formally imposed again. Then, in 2002, something happened that prevented the state from carrying out the execution. Gerald Gallego was suffering from colorectal cancer. On July 18, 2002, he died in a Nevada prison hospital. He was 56. He never faced execution. Charlene had already been released from prison in 1997 after serving her sentence. She eventually disappeared from public view, and that leaves one of the strangest endings to the entire case. A man who had been sentenced to death died in prison. The woman who had helped expose him eventually walked free. But the victims never received that second chance. Their lives ended in the late 1970s and 1980. Their families carried the loss for decades. And the case remains a reminder of how dangerous a violent partnership can become when 2 people reinforce each other's darkest impulses. Gerald Gallego could have been a terrifying killer on his own, but with Charlene beside him, he had something even more dangerous: access, trust, mobility, and someone who could help make strangers feel safe. That partnership allowed the couple to cross state lines and continue killing for almost 2 years. They were not caught because of one brilliant detective suddenly solving everything. They were caught because the victims' stories eventually began connecting. A witness remembered a vehicle. Investigators compared cases. Information moved between jurisdictions. And finally, the trail led to Omaha. That is the part of this story that should never be forgotten. Behind every number was a person. Kippy was not a number. Rhonda was not a number. Brenda was not a number. Sandra was not a number. Stacy was not a number. Karen was not a number. Linda was not a number. Virginia was not a number. Craig was not a number. Mary Beth was not a number. They were sons and daughters, friends, sisters, partners, people who had plans for the future, people who expected to wake up the next morning. Instead, their lives became part of a case that would haunt California, Nevada, and Oregon. The Gallegos believed they could keep moving. They believed another city could erase what they had done in the last one. But crime leaves traces. A witness, a license plate, a statement, a piece of evidence, a memory. And sometimes years later, those pieces finally come together. The killer couple that had terrorized America could run from state to state, but they could not outrun the evidence. And eventually, the road they had used to escape justice became the road that led police directly to them.